In this video, I just want to talk about some really basic rules or guidelines that you can use to glean an extra couple of marks in the melody writing question without even really having to know any extra music theory. It's just a couple of extra little things you can do that are really important and they boost your mark, but they're so simple and it's so important not to leave them out. So the very first one I'm going to look at, this is this comes from the 2015 exam paper. The very first one I'm going to look at is this. You have to make sure you end your 16-bar melody on the note Do. That means Do in terms of solfege. So what that means is the home note of whatever key you're in. So for example, as you can see from our key signature up here, we are in B flat major. Okay? We're in B flat major. So that means we have to end on the note B flat. If we were in G major, we'd end on G. If we were in E major, we would end on E. It's so simple, just make sure you end on the right note and it makes such a big difference. The next rule, is you have to make sure you put in your phrase marks. Phrase marks are, some people do like an arc that goes over each phrase of your music, but I just think it's much neater and just as acceptable to put in almost like a little inverted comma at the end of each phrase. Just one at the end of each line. Sometimes it's not exactly at the end of the line. As you can see, we've got our upbeat here, which means that our phrase ends, this is a quaver note, so it ends a quaver note before the end of the line. I'll explain that in much more detail in a later video. But just if you've got an upbeat, then you count back however many beats are in the upbeat from the end of the line, and that's where you've got your phrase mark. So these are each of our phrase marks. Again, makes such a big difference, so simple to do. Next thing is you have to make sure that you've got your instrument. You really need to make sure you write in which instrument you want to play it for. Again, it's such a simple thing to do, but it makes such a big difference. And along with your instrument, you have to write a few little directions for your instrument to use. So for example, this is for violin, so it's very important I've got my bowing in here. Because of an upbeat, I've started on an up bow. This little V symbol is for up bow with a violin. And this little bracket here is a down bow. So I started my main one on a down bow. And the other important thing for a violin, if you're writing for violin, is you've got these slurs in here because they tell the violinist to continue with just one bow for all of those notes. It's just some kind of direction. You don't need to become a violinist to learn this. You don't need to learn it in detail, but you do need to have some of these slurs in for a violinist and one or two of these bowing marks just at the beginning, just to show that you're aware of them and of their importance. The other instruments you could have are flute, maybe oboe. I wouldn't go beyond that. Violin, flute, or oboe are the main ones because anything more than that and there's just too much room for mistakes. If you're writing for flute, make sure your melody does not go below middle C. It's just very important because your flute can't play any lower than that. And the oboe, again, generally stay above middle C. Violin, you can go right down to G below the treble clef. So violin is usually the most versatile. I would recommend writing for violin. Okay. The other thing, and you may notice this throughout the melody, is that I'm moving mostly stepwise movements. So that means mostly one line to one space at a time. See, like this. You got more of it here. One line or one space. I don't make big jumps. The only time I really make jumps is if I'm going between notes of a given chord. So for example, I've got here, it goes from A to F to A to C and then up to F. That's the notes of the chord F, which is chord 5 in this case. So I'm allowed to make leaps here. You can make leaps if they're between the notes of a strong chord. You've got it again here. You got leaps between an F, a C, an A, and an F because that's the chord F. You got it again here. You can only really do it between the notes of a strong chord like chord 1 or chord 5. I wouldn't recommend using leaps other than that much. I'd recommend mostly sticking to stepwise movement like this. Okay, that's rule number 4. Rule number 5 is you have to make sure you've got your tempo marking. So I've got andante in here. Just get a different color. Andante is my tempo marking. Andante means at a walking pace is the literal translation. It's slow to medium, I suppose. You could also have allegro, which means quick. You could have adagio, which means very slow. As long as you've got a tempo marking in there, you're going to pick up marks. Okay. Rule number 6, you have to have your dynamics in there. So you may have noticed our instrument and our tempo markings are written above the stave. Our dynamics, we write them below the stave. Okay. And you just need to have a couple of these in here. Your MFs and your MPs and your Ps and your Fs and your double Fs. And what works in conjunction with those then is these hairpins, these crescendos and decrescendos. I've actually not put any decrescendos in here, but you can have them. Decrescendos are just the opposite of crescendos. It's when the music gradually gets quieter. This is when it gradually gets louder, as you can see. And I tend to put these crescendo marks in if I'm ever moving from one dynamic to another. So for example, I started on MP here, and when you get towards the end, I want to be at F here, and it starts getting louder from MP to F here. So you don't just want to have it like a hairpin, a crescendo or decrescendo just in the middle of nowhere on its own. You want to have it going from one dynamic marking to another one, and if it's a crescendo, you want it going from a quieter dynamic marking to a louder one, like MP to F or like MF to double F. Or if it's a decrescendo, you want to go from a louder one to a quieter one. Okay, and that will, it's just, these are best used at climactic points. So for example, when the music's moving up, tend to have a crescendo. As you can see, it's going up the way here again. And I've got my little crescendo. And at the end, where it's very important to have a climactic point where you build to your final do note, I've got it all going up the way here in my notes, and I've got my big crescendo going from MF to double F. So those are the main rules. It's just some extra little stuff to learn. Make sure that it's in there, and you don't need to know any extra music theory. It takes about 5 minutes at the end of your composition, and it makes such a big difference. Just for you to review, if you want to take any notes yourself, I'm going to write down these rules one more time here for you to learn. So you have to make sure you end on do. That was our first rule, end on do. Our second rule, make sure you've got your phrase marks. That was the little commas at the end of each phrase. Rule number 3, that was make sure you have your instrument in there. I would recommend you use violin, it's the most versatile. You could also use flute or oboe. Anything beyond that is a risk, because if you don't know the instrument, you might end up writing for an instrument that's meant to be in a different clef, or it's a transposing instrument, or it has some kind of restrictions. I would recommend violin personally. It would just make it a lot easier for you. Rule 4 is make sure it's mostly stepwise movement. Mostly stepwise movement. Or if you are doing leaps, make sure it's between notes of a strong chord, like chord 1 or chord 5. Rule number 5, you want to make sure you've got your tempo marking in there. That's your speed of music. So andante, adagio, allegro. Make sure you just know a couple of these. I would know those 3 if I were you. Adagio is slow, andante is slow to medium, allegro is quite fast. And use one of those. Rule number 6, dynamics. Make sure you've got your dynamics in there. That's a MF and a F and a P, etc. And rule number 7 is make sure you've got your crescendos, crescendo and decrescendo markings in there. And these work in conjunction with our dynamic markings, and generally go crescendo from a low dynamic marking to a high dynamic marking, decrescendo from a high dynamic marking to a low one, and try to use those at climactic points in the melody. So you're crescendoing to high notes at a climactic point, or decrescendoing as the music goes down.